Perhaps no other time in Russian history do we see a conflict between tradition and modernization than in 19th century Imperial Russia. Russia continued to emerge as a major empire in the 19th century. Patterns of modernization and expansion that had been started by Peter the Great and continued by Catherine the Great continued in this century. As a measure of its strength, Russia would survive a major invasion attempt in this century, fight a war against England and France, continue to expand to the south, experience modernization, free the serfs, embark on a new pattern of industrialization, and also endure the assassination of two czars in this century. Yet by the end of the 19th century, Russia still was, in many ways, a backward state with inefficient and corrupt government, an economy of much poverty and boiling discontent that started to manifest itself in violence, sabotage, assassinations, and revolt in the 19th century would of course completely explode at the beginning of the 20th century through revolution and even greater upheavals. After the very consequential reign of Catherine the Great, the Russian throne passed to Tsar Paul I. Paul was the son of Peter III and Catherine the Great. His father, Peter III, was obsessed with the German or Prussian military traditions and despised his Russian subjects and culture. The Empress Elizabeth had arranged for the marriage between Peter III and the German princess who would eventually become the Empress Catherine II the Great. Catherine had stolen the throne from her husband in 1762 by conspiring with her lover, Gregory Orlov, and the Imperial Guard, who disposed, arrested, and most likely murdered Catherine's husband and made her the empress. Catherine the Great strongly suggested in her memoirs that her supposed son and heir to the throne, Paul, was actually the offspring of her first great lover, Sergei Saltykov. Yet Paul's temperament and looks seem much more in line with Catherine's real husband, Peter III. Indeed, Paul resembled much of Peter III's abrasive and rude personality that made him, just like Peter III, his father, very unpopular and despised by many. Upon his birth, Paul was taken by the Empress Elizabeth from his mother Catherine, who he was able to see. She was able to see on a very limited basis for the majority of his childhood. His mother, Catherine the Great, arranged for a marriage for Paul by finding him a wife among the minor princesses of the German states. She chose Princess Wilhelmina of Hesse-Darmstadt, who acquired the Russian name of Natalia Alexeyevna. Natalia agreed to marry Paul, the Russian heir, but privately despised him. It's actually quite possible that she began an extended love affair with her husband's best friend, Andrei Razumovsky. Andrei had been sent by Catherine to sail Natalia to Russia to meet Paul, but it's quite possible that an affair between the two began immediately during the journey to Russia and even before Natalia even met her future husband and heir to the throne, Paul. Natalia never bothered to learn Russian, and she actually entertained several plots against Catherine and was known for her stubborn and impetuous nature. Wilhelmina, however, died in childbirth on April 15, 1776, 3 years after the wedding. After the death of his first wife, Paul's mother, Catherine the Great, endeavored to find a second wife for her son. Catherine chose another German princess, the beautiful Sophia Dorothea of Württemberg. She received the new Orthodox name Maria Fedorovna and married Paul 6 months after the death of his first wife in October of 1776. Maria bore Paul a son named Alexander, who would become heir to the Russian throne. Catherine permitted Paul and Maria to travel around Western Europe before his ascension to the throne. Paul maintained a distant relationship with his mother, Catherine the Great. Remember that Paul had been taken away from Catherine at birth to be raised by the Empress Elizabeth, and was often raised with great neglect. As an infant, Paul once fell out of his crib, and because no one noticed he had fallen asleep on the floor, he just remained there the rest of the night. Once his mother, Catherine, did ascend to the throne, she proved herself really incapable of being an effective mother. Paul grew angry at his mother, Catherine, for the endless gifts she bestowed on her lovers, and often at the cost of neglecting her own son. Upon the occasion of one of her birthdays, Catherine once gave one of her lovers 50,000 rubles, whereas she only gave her son a cheap, worthless watch. Paul lived apart from his mother and the palace, and therefore became a very vocal critic of his mother's policies. Paul preferred to spend his time, like his deposed and murdered father Peter III before him, practicing Prussian military drills, openly expressing his contempt of Russia and his preference for all things German. After Catherine suffered a stroke and died in 1796, Paul ascended to the position of Tsar in 1796. Paul required his soldiers to wear very Prussian-looking military uniforms. And just like his father before him, Paul was fascinated with military drills, military protocol, parades, uniforms, but was actually quite fearful at the prospect of fighting a real battle. And therefore, his soldiers had to practice endless drilling exercises, sometimes in the rain or freezing cold. He would severely punish soldiers who made mistakes in the drills and marches, and even sentence one regiment to walk all the way to Siberia for their disorderliness. Paul spent money lavishly out of the treasury for the construction of 3 palaces. He was also pathetically obsessed with the love of one of his mistresses. Upon ascending to the throne, Paul ordered the bones of Grigory Potemkin, one of his mother Catherine's lovers, to be dug out of its grave and scattered. Paul's anger against his mother Catherine influenced his policies as Tsar, particularly in the area of foreign affairs. Paul had Russian armies that were advancing in the south against the Turks retreat, and he, just like his father Peter III before him, identified Prussia as an ally. He also came to despise France because it was a country his mother Catherine had adored so much. Paul was known for his vindictive, and malicious, and very unattractive personality. He was enormously unpopular. He liberated and elevated many of Catherine's critics and did little to ingratiate himself with the nobility or royal court. As a result of Paul's policies, many in the army and at court and in the nobility really came to despise the Tsar and his German interests and his very irascible nature. Paul endeavored to impose a code of chivalry on the nobles that distanced their support from him even further. Paul made it more difficult for the boyar or noble landholders to punish their serfs, and he seemed to support the poor classes over the boyars at every opportunity. A group of conspirators therefore plotted to murder the Tsar and turn back his reforms that didn't favor the nobility. So after a heavy night of drinking, a group of army officers who had been dismissed from their positions converged on St. Michael's Castle in St. Petersburg to kill the Tsar. Conspirators burst into Tsar Paul's bedroom and found the Tsar hiding behind a set of curtains, having been alerted to the threat against his life. Paul was dragged out from behind the curtains, either because he failed to conceal his toes beneath the curtains, or possibly sneezed, thus alerting the conspirators to his position. Initially, the conspirators wanted him to sign an edict of his abdication, give up the throne, but then he was struck with a sword, strangled, and then trampled to death. Paul's son Alexander was actually in the palace at the time of the murder and had consented to his father being deposed and removed from the throne, but he certainly didn't anticipate the murder of his father. Therefore, Alexander, his son, became Tsar, but he didn't ever punish his father's murderers. In fact, the official court physician labeled Paul's cause of death as a stroke, and he really was not mourned upon his passing. Paul was subsequently buried with other Romanov Tsars in the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. Therefore, Alexander ascended to his father's throne upon the assassination of Tsar Paul I. Alexander had been born in St. Petersburg and had been taken under the supervision as a child by his grandmother, Catherine the Great. There were rumors that Catherine actually wanted Alexander to ascend to the throne in place of her own son Paul, but nothing ever came of the plans. Alexander grew up under the influence of a more modern priest, a Swiss tutor, and as a rarity for the Russian royal family, learned to speak English with excellence. He would enjoy one of the most consequential reigns, the most important reigns, certainly in 19th century Russia. At the age of 15, he married under his grandmother Catherine's direction a 14-year-old German princess who took the Orthodox name of Elizabeth Alexeyevna. Catherine had the Alexander Palace built for the young couple, and they often remained under her constant supervision. Throughout his youth, Alexander felt caught between the authority of the Empress Catherine the Great and the authority of his father Paul as the heir to the throne. Upon the ascension of his father to the throne, Alexander was even more unhappy than under the rulership of his grandmother. His father was deeply unpopular, and Alexander himself called Russia under his father's rule a, quote, plaything for the insane, unquote. Historians believe that Alexander knew about the plot of the conspirators to depose his father and make him Tsar, but that he believed it would not involve his father's murder. Indeed, Alexander lived much of the rest of his life in remorse, knowing that he gained the Russian throne through the murder of his father. Alexander was crowned Emperor of Russia in the Kremlin in 1801. Alexander, as Tsar, was ably assisted and advised during the first half of his reign by Mikhail Speransky. With Speransky's influence and advice, Alexander redesigned the Russian government to make it more efficient. He created new departments for the government, including a Department of War. Alexander also contemplated greater freedoms, rights, and even emancipation for the serfs. In the end, Alexander's reforms had little impact on the average serf, but he did open up new opportunities for some emancipated serfs to enjoy the right of property ownership. Only 3 universities existed in Russia at the beginning of Alexander's reign. The new Tsar added 3 more with the foundings of the universities at St. Petersburg, Kharkov, and Kazan. Alexander's reign is best remembered, however, for the foreign policy crisis that dominated European affairs at that time, which was the growing empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. Napoleon Bonaparte had emerged as the Emperor of France after the chaos of the French Revolution, and one by one he had succeeded in defeating the major armies of Europe and had conquered the Italian peninsula, Spain, Egypt, Austria, and even Prussia. Alexander was initially a great admirer of Napoleon as a hero of reform and liberalism. Indeed, the 2 emperors had even signed 2 treaties together at Tilsit, meeting each other on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. But gradually Alexander came to see Napoleon as a brutal tyrant and joined the growing international alliance against him. Alexander's relationship with Napoleon was strained when the Tsar refused to give away his sister to be Napoleon's bride, and the 2 monarchs increasingly distrusted each other. Russia continued an illegal trade with Britain, which angered Napoleon, and Napoleon failed to fulfill his promise to Alexander to support Russian campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Realizing the Russian emperor was no longer a true ally and would not submit to his authority, Napoleon launched a massive invasion of Russia in June of 1812. This army that Napoleon composed was one of the largest armies in world history. At its greatest height, in June of 1812, right before, on the eve of the invasion of Russia, it included somewhere around 685,000 men. Now, most of the members of the Grande Armée, the Grand Army, were 550,000 Frenchmen, but there were also many other nationalities and ethnic groups who had joined this army because Napoleon had conquered their country, and they had also been drafted into the Grand Armée, including Germans and some Austrians and Swiss, Scandinavians, and even some Irish. This very large army crossed the Niemen River in June, and it enjoyed early successes in their invasion against Russian forces, brushing them aside as they marched towards Moscow. In August 1812, 2 of the largest armies ever assembled clashed in Smolensk. During the hard-fought battle, described by Leo Tolstoy in his famous novel War and Peace, Napoleon captured the city. Total losses were estimated at around 30,000 men. Napoleon continued his march deeper and deeper into Russia, anticipating he would be able to provide food and fodder for his army by living off the Russian land itself, pillaging and plundering fields and homes as he marched. Yet the Russians thwarted Napoleon's campaign by practicing scorched earth policy, wherein a retreating army burns or destroys all of its own fields and livestock as it retreats to prevent an invading army from gaining additional supplies amidst its campaign. Thus, as Napoleon's army moved deeper into Russia, it increasingly faced greater and greater food shortages and fodder for horses as they are further and further away from France and away from home. Many of Napoleon's troops began to defect and abandon their positions, yet Napoleon still counted on making it to Moscow, where he was sure he would be able to attain as many supplies as he needed in the great historical city. Tsar Alexander's imperial army continued to retreat and scorched the earth as they did so, but the Russians also continued to harass and ambush the invading French. At the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon's Grande Armée launched an attack against the Russian army, driving it back from its initial positions, but failing to gain a decisive victory. Both armies were exhausted after the battle, and the Russians withdrew from the field the following day. The Battle of Borodino involved around 250,000 troops and left at least 70,000 casualties, making Borodino the deadliest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Borodino represented the last Russian effort at stopping the French advance on Moscow. However, the French had no clear way of forcing Tsar Alexander to capitulate, to surrender, because the Russian army was not decisively defeated. Therefore, the Russians decided to permit Napoleon and his army to move all the way into Moscow, after much of the city's population had already retreated to the east. Therefore, a week after the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow, but there was no delegation to meet the emperor. Napoleon was expecting the Tsar to meet with him and sue for peace, and then the French would be served all the provisions that they wanted in the captured historic city. But no government representatives, particularly the Tsar, could be found to sign a treaty, and the city was simply abandoned and left to the starving, exhausted, frustrated, lonely, far from home French, who had very few supplies. The city's governor ordered several strategic points in the city of Moscow to be set ablaze. Most of Moscow was composed of wood structures, and thus very quickly the fire spread across the city. The Russians had disabled the firefighting equipment, and widespread looting and violence broke out across the city. The French failed to find water hoses to extinguish the fire. Estimates are that 4/5 of the entire city of Moscow burned, leaving Napoleon none of the supplies he so desperately needed for his exhausted and starving army, which was far from home and deep into enemy territory. Napoleon lost a precious month waiting in Moscow for the Tsar to sign a peace treaty, but no word from Alexander came, thus forcing Napoleon to evacuate Moscow and begin the very long retreat out of Russia, all the way back to France on already depleted resources and the total exhaustion of his men. The Russian general and war hero Mikhail Kutuzov forced the French to retreat on the same corridor, the same route through which they had marched and had gone to Moscow. That route, of course, had already been scorched earth, been stripped of crops, food, and grasslands. The starving French were unable to feed their horses and often had to resort to shooting them for food. And then the Russian winter descended with all its brutal fury on the retreating French army. The French troops were only outfitted with summer clothing, and their horses were not properly shoed to cross snowy and icy terrain. Temperatures plummeted to single digits, and then to 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Hypothermia and starvation caused the deaths of thousands of retreating troops. French troops fell asleep in the cold, sitting before a campfire, and froze to death. Horses froze solid in the snow, standing up. Cannibalism occurred among the French soldiers as they were so desperate for food that they would eat the fingers, arms, and legs of their dead comrades. Diseases such as diphtheria, dysentery, and typhus took many more lives. Even though the French retreat was complete by the end of November, the French would later point out they were defeated by their enemies of General January and General February, referencing the infamous Russian winters. Napoleon's invasion of Russia remains one of the most catastrophic military disasters of all time. Whereas he entered Russia with approximately 500,000 troops, he returned with approximately 50,000. Many of his troops were lost to defections, expirations of time of service, captured as POWs, killed in battle, or starved or frozen to death during his humiliating retreat all the way back from Moscow. This chart is a good visual depiction of the strength and width of the brown line of how large Napoleon's army was when it entered Russia, and then the black line shows the retreat and just how thin and how small that army was by the time it had left Russia. With the Russian army following up victory over Napoleon in 1812, a new coalition was formed with Russia, Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Sweden, Spain, and other nations. Although the French were victorious in the initial battles during the campaign in Germany, they were eventually defeated at the Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of the Nations, in the autumn of 1813, which proved to be a decisive victory. As a result, Napoleon was forced to abdicate his throne in April of 1814. For the first time in 400 years, foreign troops, including Russian troops under Tsar Alexander's commands, entered and occupied Paris. As a result of the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna was held in 1815. The purpose of this Congress was to divide up Napoleon's empire and establish new lines for nations, new boundaries for nations, and also determine who is legitimate monarch for each of those nations. As a result, Russia, under Alexander I, played a new, increasingly important role in world affairs and particularly foreign policy at this Congress of Vienna. In fact, Alexander was a strong advocate of the idea of a holy alliance of the Christian heads of Europe, the Christian nations of Europe, coming together to stop further tyrants and conquerors like Napoleon and also squelch rebellion in any of their neighboring countries. With his mental health deteriorating, however, Alexander grew increasingly suspicious of those around him. He became more withdrawn, but also more religious, more passive. Some historians have concluded his profile coincides precisely with a schizophrenic prototype, a withdrawn, seclusive, rather shy and introverted, unaggressive, and somewhat apathetic individual. Alexander contracted typhus during a trip to southern Russia and died in the city of Taganrog. As a result, rumors persisted after Alexander's death that he had so desperately wanted peace and quiet and escaped the life of the royal court that the Tsar had faked his own death and lived out the rest of his days as a monk named Fyodor Kuzmich. There were many similarities between the Tsar and the monk who was later canonized in the Russian Orthodox Church in 1984. Legends persist even today that as late as 1921, Alexander's coffin had been opened repeatedly and always found to be empty. Alexander's wife had borne him 2 children, but both of them had died young. Therefore, the throne passed to Alexander's younger brother, Nicholas. 5 months after his birth, Nicholas's father, Paul, became the Emperor of Russia. His father was murdered, of course, in 1801, enabling his older brother Alexander to come to the throne in 1801. Nicholas married the Prussian princess Charlotte of Prussia in July of 1817, and upon her conversion to the Russian Orthodox Church, changed her name to Alexandra Fyodorovna. It seemed unlikely that Nicholas, as the third-born son of Paul, would ascend to the throne, yet when Alexander died of typhus and his older brother Constantine declared his refusal to become Tsar, Nicholas assented to the position and was declared to be Tsar in 1825. Nicholas's reign commenced on a very cold Monday, which superstitious Russians deemed to be a bad omen of an impending bad reign. Indeed, the ascension to the throne by Nicholas was marred by the events of the Decembrist Revolt. Educated nobles, or boyars, who wanted to see reforms in the Russian government, including the introduction of a constitution and the reality of self-government, formed an alliance known as the Northern Union. The Northern Union organized a demonstration on the very first day of Nicholas's reign, which the Tsar ordered other soldiers to smash and dissolve. Army officers led approximately 3,000 regular soldiers in a protest amid St. Peter's Square in St. Petersburg, the day after Christmas, December 26, 1825. The standoff between the protesters, known as the Decembrists, and troops loyal to the Tsar lasted for hours until finally Tsar Nicholas ordered cannons to fire into the crowd of protesters. Many of the Decembrists retreated to the frozen Neva River, where they were again blasted with the Tsar's cannons, breaking the ice, into which many fell into the icy waters and drowned. The leaders of the Decembrists were hunted down, arrested, tried, and hanged for conspiring against the Tsar. The shock of the Decembrist revolt and the belief that his throne and powers were threatened provoked the Tsar to issue an even harsher repressions on the people, including censorship and the commissioning of spies to report on the activities of the people. Common Russians began to report that it was impossible to sneeze in one's house before the emperor already knew about it. Nicholas I conducted a very aggressive foreign policy that included several very expensive wars which were devastating for the nation's finances. Nicholas kept a standing army of 1 million men and frequently dressed in military uniform and conducted numerous parades of soldiers. In reality, the Russian army was built on outdated tactics and weaponry better at drilling rather than real military tactics. Incompetent generals, reluctant conscripts, and even convicted criminals filled many positions in the regular army. Nicholas appointed a majority of military men to government positions who often proved incompetent and corrupt. Russia under Nicholas I did score a major victory in the Battle of Navarino in October of 1827. The victory assisted the Greeks in their rebellion against the Turks and marked the effective end of Ottoman rule in Greece. The victory also augmented Russia's belief that it was to protect Orthodox Christians wherever they lived, particularly under Ottoman rule to the south. In 1826 to 1828, Nicholas also fought the Russo-Persian War, which ended with Persia being forced to cede its last remaining territories in the Caucasus Mountains. By then, Russia had conquered all the territories of Iran in the Caucasus, comprising modern-day Russian states of Georgia, Dagestan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan through the course of the 19th century. Nicholas's confidence in his military and strategic know-how, along with his territorial aspirations, got the best of him, however, in launching the ill-fated Crimean War, which lasted from 1853 to 1856. This war would prove to be as much a disaster for the losing power of Russia as it would be for the victors, England, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The Russian destruction of the Turkish fleet at the Battle of Sinop on November 30th, 1853, was what sparked the war. The Russians made swift work of the Turkish fleet with its use of the new weapon of exploding cannon shells, and it seemed that Russia would be able to continue to march south, run roughshod over the decaying Ottoman Empire with no one to stop their growth in the east. Russia had hoped to take advantage of this increasingly declining Ottoman Empire and seize additional territories on its southern border. Russia had also sought additional territories along the Danube River, as well as continuing the right to protect Orthodox Christians in the territories of the Ottoman Empire. What started as a regional war between Russia and the Ottomans, however, expanded to a much larger war with England and France allied together with the Ottomans against Russia, born of a great fear of the growing strength of Russia to the east of Europe. The English and French landed tens of thousands of troops on the shores of the Black Sea to move against the Russian armies descending from the north. The British and French campaigning against Russia in the Crimean War used Varna as headquarters and a principal naval base. The British and French landed 60,000 troops on the Crimean Peninsula and commenced an 11-month siege against the Russian fortifications at Sevastopol. It is possible that the British and French could have quickly overwhelmed the town of Sevastopol. However, they embarked on enormous delays and took so long to get set up that it allowed the Russians to also entrench their fortifications around Sevastopol and also set up very large guns that therefore delayed conquering the city. Indeed, conditions, particularly in the British camp outside of the siege of Sevastopol, deteriorated very quickly. The army suffered from gross negligence by the officers for the welfare of the men, and disease, filth, lice, flies, rats, mud, and rotten supplies ran rampant through the camps. Starving horses lacking fodder actually started eating each other's tails. Men were buried in shallow graves with arms and legs still protruding from the ground. And a sudden hurricane smashed the British fleet that was moored at Balaclava. Cholera, a bacterial infection that causes tremendous diarrhea, dehydration, and death, claimed more lives than bullets in the Crimean campaign. The deplorable conditions in the trenches foreshadowed World War I trench warfare and the high death rate due to industrialized warfare. To add to the tragedy, a British commander who had never led troops into battle ordered a very ill-fated cavalry charge into a wide-open valley against Russian guns trained on the British troops from the hills above. On October 25, 1854, the famous Charge of the Light Brigade occurred upon a miscommunication among British officers, leading to a direct charge against well-entrenched Russian guns. The 670 British troops nobly charged into the withering fire, but were routed, suffering 110 killed and 161 wounded. This is a famous photograph from that charge, and you can see the cannonballs, but also portions of human beings left over in the valley from this massive assault against the British cavalry unit. The French were finally able to win a significant battle outside of the besieged city of Sevastopol at Malakoff on September 8, 1855. The French victory at Malakoff enabled the French to finally move against Sevastopol, leading to its surrender and ending its 11-month siege. As a result of the peace treaty that was signed at the end of the Crimean War, Russia surrendered control of the Danube River and the Black Sea. Isolated and facing a bleak prospect of invasion from the West if the war continued, Russia was agreed to the peace treaty. The war was also enormously unpopular at home for the French and the British. As a result of the peace treaty, also, the treaty forbade Russia from basing warships in the Black Sea, and some of the Ottoman northern states became largely independent. Christians, or particularly Orthodox Christians, were granted a degree of official equality, and the Orthodox Church regained control of the Christian churches in dispute. Therefore, Britain, France, and Russia all withdrew from the Crimea. As a result of the war, 250,000 soldiers died in the course of the war. Most of the casualties were due to disease, particularly cholera. It was the famous British nurse, Florence Nightingale, who came to the army hospital of the British at Scutari and was horrified how filthy the hospital and the camp was. As a result, she immediately ordered her other nurses to start cleaning the hospital, also to clean and dress wounds, remove the maggots from many of the wounds of the men, also to replace dressings, and also provide fresh air into the hospital. As a result, the mortality rate significantly declined as a result of the efforts of Florence Nightingale. One side strange story is that the oldest living veteran of the Crimean War that came home from the Crimea to England was this turtle. This turtle was discovered by the British during the Crimean War and brought back from Russia. He was nicknamed Timothy, or Tim, and he became the last veteran of the Crimean War, not dying until 2004. Nicholas himself died on March 2, 1855, while the war in the Crimea was still raging. He had caught a chill and refused medical treatment and died of pneumonia, although there were actually rumors he had committed suicide. He too was buried into the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Alexander was the eldest son of Tsar Nicholas I. He was born in Moscow in 1818. Alexander really didn't demonstrate any notable promise as a child and youth. Historians have detected an aversion on his part toward military matters and engaging in warfare. This aversion probably stems from his father's obsession with military culture, drilling, parades, and planning. The Crimean War had gone poorly for Russia, and thus Alexander had little interest in launching Russia into additional wars during his reign. Alexander traveled extensively before he ascended to the throne, and like Peter the Great before him, Alexander became acutely aware during his time in Western Europe just how backward and old-fashioned Russia was compared to the rest of Europe. Alexander's tutor was a liberal romantic poet, and thus between his tutor and his travels, Alexander came to develop an esteem for the West and a desire for Russia to copy its advancements. On an 1839 tour of Europe, Alexander met the 20-year-old Queen Victoria of Great Britain. They may have actually fallen in love with each other, although the relationship was never pursued. Alexander also became the first heir apparent to ever visit the region of Siberia, far to Russia's east. Tsar Alexander II would become responsible for many reforms, including reorganizing the judicial system, setting up elected local judges, abolishing corporal punishment, promoting local self-government, imposing universal military service, and ending some privileges of the nobility. He even promoted university education. Alexander II realized Russia was far behind Europe, particularly in regards to agriculture, and therefore he issued a series of famous reforms, the most famous of which was the Emancipation Edict of 1861. This edict of the Tsar liberated all serfs, granted them full rights of free citizens, including the rights to marry without having to gain consent from their landowners, and to own a property or own a business. It was one of the most significant events in Russian history, and it comes incredibly late. Most of Western Europe had released their serfs hundreds of years ago. American slavery would last very late into modern world history as well, to 1863. But Russia is incredibly tardy in regards to the rest of the world in liberating the serfs. As a result, after their liberation, serfs created what were called mirs, or village communes, which collected land payments from peasants and paid for land grants. The former serfs, now freed, enjoyed actually a measure of self-government. In what were called zemstvos, or local assemblies, there was actually a measure of some voting and also the provision of some local services. Alexander II's reign also witnesses a major transfer of an important landmass, which for a long time had been a Russian colony. Russian America referred to the large landmass that became known as Alaska. This is a picture of the Russian settlement of St. Paul's Harbor at Kodiak Island in 1814. Russia was interested in its colony of Alaska originally for its trade in pelts, which are furs, and hoped that there were other natural resources to be exploited there as well. However, by the late 1800s, there are increasing reasons why Russia was interested in selling its colony of Alaska, which of course it does to the United States in the Alaska Treaty of Secession in 1867. The Alaska Treaty of Secession had many motivations for the Russians. Russia had experienced enormous financial losses after the Crimean War. And Russia was really concerned about the British actually stealing or seizing Alaska from it without any payment. And Russia knew it could do very little to prevent that. Also, there were very low profits of trade with Alaskan settlements. It really wasn't financially worth Russia holding on to this territory. So fearing that they were going to lose it anyway by a British seizure, the Americans stepped in and were very interested in purchasing it. Therefore, it was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, William H. Seward, who negotiated a deal to buy the territory of Alaska from the Russian government for $7.2 million. This is a picture of the actual check used for the transaction. That would correspond to roughly a little over $100 million today, in today's money, for all the territory of Alaska. And that purchase represents less than 2 cents per acre. That's actually a better deal than what the United States had achieved in the Louisiana Purchase. Now, there's actually a lot of public criticism, absolutely, and some outrage in the United States over the purchase of this by Secretary of State William H. Seward. Many in the press called it Seward's folly and Seward's icebox, and questioned why all that money was spent by the United States government to buy Alaska. When in reality, many in the United States government really believed that gold could be discovered in the Alaskan hills. And indeed, at the turn of the century, there are 2 Alaskan gold rushes that produce some gold. Much more important is, of course, is the discovery of oil in Prudhoe Bay, the northern side of Alaska, which becomes the second largest reservoir of oil in U.S. territory, and of course is an invaluable natural resource. 19th century Russia is a fascinating place, and we see the emergence of some fascinating characters as well, particularly the starets. The starets were kind of like traveling prophets, mystics. They claimed to have healing powers, or they could pronounce a blessing or a curse. Most of the time, they were members of the Russian Orthodox clergy, but sometimes they are more like monks, more sort of traveling figures, and they come to be esteemed for their prophecies and also supposedly their ability to heal people. And of course, they will become very important with the coming of the Russian Revolution and the emergence of Father Grigory Rasputin. Another important group in late 19th century was the terrorist organization known as the People's Will. The People's Will was a 19th century revolutionary political organization in the Russian Empire, which conducted assassinations of government officials. Their main goal was to overthrow the Tsarist system. And even though Alexander II had enacted some of the most consequential liberating reforms of any Tsar, including freeing the serfs, the People's Will didn't believe it had gone far enough and opposed the authoritarian government of the Tsarist system. The People's Will declared itself to be a populist or a people's movement and was composed primarily of young revolutionary socialists and intellectuals who believed in the value and the effectiveness of terrorism. One of their more famous members is Ignacy Hryniewicki. Hryniewicki was a Polish member of the Russian Conspirational Revolutionary Society and agreed with others that they must attempt to assassinate the Tsar. The night before the assassination, Hryniewicki wrote a letter to posterity, part of which reads, quote, "Alexander II must die. He will die, and with him, we, his enemies, his executioners, shall die too. How many more sacrifices will our unhappy country ask of its sons before it is liberated? It is my lot to die young. I shall not see our victory. I shall not live one day, 1 hour in the bright season of our triumph. But I believe that with my death I shall do all that it is my duty to do, and no one in the world can demand more of me." As a result, on a traditional parade route that Alexander II had taken many times before through the streets of St. Petersburg, on March 13, 1881, one member of the People's Will stepped forward and threw a bomb that landed directly under the horses of the Tsar's carriage. There's an enormous explosion, sending shrapnel through the air that injured bystanders and also killed the horses and the coachman driving the Tsar's carriage. The carriage was thrown overboard. The Tsar had actually survived, and he emerged from the carriage to inspect the damage, thinking that the threat was over. But in reality, Hryniewicki was standing on the side of the road and seeing the Tsar emerge, and thank God he had survived. Hryniewicki was reported to have saying, "It's too early to thank God yet," and threw another bomb right at the feet of the Tsar, and a massive explosion also killed Hryniewicki and several bystanders. The Tsar was gravely imaged and impaired. He was carried by sleigh to the Winter Palace, to his study, where ironically, almost the same day 20 years earlier, he had signed the Emancipation Edict freeing the serfs. Alexander was bleeding to death with his legs torn away, his stomach ripped open, his face was mutilated. His burns were so painful they couldn't even put a sheet on top of him. Members of the Romanov royal family came rushing to the scene, and he died at 3:30 in the afternoon, 1 hour after the bombing. On the site of the bombing that killed Alexander II, later on, the Church of the Savior on Blood, a very large Russian Orthodox church, would be constructed in St. Petersburg. Alexander II was followed by Alexander III. Alexander III was born in March of 1845, also in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. He was the second son and the third child of Emperor Alexander II. As the second son, he wasn't anticipated to inherit the throne. However, when his older brother died of spinal meningitis, It made him the heir to the throne. He would reign from 1881 to 1894. Alexander III really lacked any refinement or elegance. He projected a very rough, intimidating, strong, abrasive personality. He wasn't necessarily liked, but he was feared. He was an enormous man, very broad-shouldered. Many reported on his great strength, that your hand almost hurt if you shook the hand of the Tsar. He was a very intimidating figure, and he made very little effort to soften his rough edges. Alexander actually married his dead brother's fiancée, a Danish princess, who became Empress Maria Fedorovna upon entering the Russian Orthodox Church. Alexander was one of the very few monarchs who actually committed no adultery in his marriage. He remained very devoted to his wife through the marriage. He was actually very doting and very loving towards his children, although he preferred his younger daughters the most, more so than his oldest son and heir, Nicholas. In honor of his daughters, in 1885, it was actually Alexander III who commissioned Peter Carl Fabergé to produce the first of what would become a series of jeweled Easter eggs. Now we call those Fabergé eggs. The primary themes of the reign of Alexander III he identified as orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. These were his 3 points of emphasis, and particularly his reign occurs in the shadow of the assassination of his father. Therefore, he was known as the iron-fisted Tsar. He was determined to be tough against any threat of revolutionary activity and attempts against his life. He believed in the traditional authority of the Tsar, and he would rule with an iron hand over the people. Thus, with these three themes, he emphasized the Russian Orthodox Church is the only official, legitimate state church, autocracy, that Russia is to be ruled by one individual, an autocrat, the Tsar, and also the nationality of Russia. Indeed, he promoted Russification, in which other minorities in the Russian Empire needed to adopt and celebrate Russian culture, Russian language, and Russian ways. The iron-fisted Tsar imposed what he called exceptional measures to curb liberalism and reform. He didn't want any talk about self-government or a constitution, and therefore he ruled with an iron hand. He particularly ruled with an iron hand through his expanded use of the Okhrana. The Okhrana is one of the many secret police organizations in Russian history, starting with the Oprichniki of Ivan the Terrible. It will be continued under the Soviets with the Cheka and also the KGB. The assassination of his father, Alexander II, triggered major suppression of civil liberties in Russia by Alexander III. Indeed, police brutality burst back in full force after experiencing some restraint under the reign of Alexander II. But upon his death, Alexander III was committed to using the full force of the secret police force. Both future emperors vowed, Alexander III and Nicholas II vowed that they would not let the same fate happen to them as had happened to Alexander II in his assassination. Therefore, both of them used the Okhrana to arrest protesters and uproot suspected rebel groups, creating further suppression of personal freedom for the Russian people. The assassination of Alexander II also inspired anarchists, or those who oppose any type of government, to advocate what they called propaganda by deed, the use of spectacular acts of violence to incite revolution. This is a picture of Okhrana officers arresting one of the many revolutionaries that were deemed to be plotting against the Tsar. Indeed, the older brother of Vladimir Lenin was also arrested and executed by the Okhrana. Much of the anger and the fear of secret revolutionary activity during the reign of Alexander III and at the end of the 19th century in Russia focuses on the Jews. Much of the propaganda regarding secret plots of the Jews comes from the publication of this book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, reading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it seems like a master plan, the playbook by Jews to take over the world, to take over governments, to provoke revolution, to take over economies and media centers, and to exercise worldwide influence. It's the playbook for Jews to take over the world. However, it's a forgery. It's a false piece of propaganda that historians believe it was actually the Okhrana that had written the protocols of the elders of Zion and blamed on the Jews, therefore justifying anti Semitism, persecution, and violent pogroms against them. We see that particularly with the May Laws. The May Laws were imposed by the Tsar in 1882, by which Jews were forbidden to settle anew outside of their own towns and boroughs. They were not allowed to gain new mortgages or other deeds, and Jews were also forbidden from transacting business on Sundays. These may seem like minor restrictions, but gradually they morph into much more violent actions, the famous pogroms of late 19th century Russia directed against its large Jewish population. Indeed, pogroms, which are popular uprisings or riots, violent acts against Jewish businesses, Jewish homes, synagogues, Jewish institutes of culture, and actually violent attacks against Jewish men, women, and children, particularly old men, become a real black mark against 19th century Russia. Many of these Jews, trying to get away from this persecution in Russia, flee to the West, and particularly Germany, which they deemed to be safe at the beginning of the 20th century. Many of these Jews also emigrate to the United States in its great age of immigration at the end of the 19th century. Probably as a result of the Crimean War, and also the excessive military drilling of Nicholas I, Alexander III, despite his rough and tough, abrasive, and very autocratic personality, actually became known as the peacemaker. He signs a very important peace treaty of alliance with the French. Alexander III was very much interested in forming a relationship with the French, and particularly in fear of Germany. Therefore, he signs this peace treaty in 1892 with the French, promising to come to their aid in the event of attack, France promising also to do the same for Russia. This is going to be one of those important alliances that, as World War I breaks out in the fall of 1914 in Europe, in many ways, France and Russia are forced to go to war against Germany because of this peace treaty, and all of Europe will be sucked into war. Alexander III died of kidney failure at the age of 49, leaving the throne to his much weaker and very shy oldest son, Nicholas II. Nicholas II, of course, would prove to be the last Tsar of Russia, as he will lose his throne in 1917 in the chaos of the Russian Revolution, and then he and his entire family will be murdered the following year in 1918. A few other notes about 19th century Russia include that in this century, and particularly as a legacy of the loss in the Crimean War, Russia becomes acutely aware how far behind it is, and therefore embarks on an aggressive program of industrialization. This includes the development of weapons and also expansion of coal mining and the development of some new factories, but it also particularly includes railroads. Russia's first railway was opened in 1837. It was only a 16-mile line between the capital of St. Petersburg and the suburban residences of nearby Tsarskaya Selo. The second railway was the St. Petersburg-Moscow Railway, which connected the two very important cities, which was built between 1842 and 1851. However, Russia remained far behind much of Western Europe in rail construction, and by 1855 it only had 570 miles of railway. That's far less than much of what Western Europe had. However, the Trans-Siberian Railway was built between 1891 and 1916. It was done under the supervision of Russian government ministers that were personally appointed by Tsar Alexander III and his successor, Nicholas II. Even before it was completed, it attracted travelers who wrote of their adventures on the railroad. And eventually, the Trans-Siberian Railroad would connect Moscow all the way to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast and be completed in 1916. There are very many famous Russians in the 19th century that made major important contributions to many fields of knowledge. One of those in the field of science, chemistry, physics was Dmitry Mendeleev. Mendeleev is given credit for his development of the periodic table. According to Mendeleev, he developed his 1871 periodic table In a dream, he said, I saw in a dream a table where all elements fell into place as required. Awakening, I immediately wrote it down on a piece of paper. Only in one place did a correction later seem necessary. Mendeleev will be the first of many important Russian scientists, physicists, and chemists into the 20th century. 19th century also witnesses a huge explosion of arts in 19th century Russia. This includes literature and also music. The most famous of all Russian poets and playwrights was Alexander Pushkin. He had published his first poem at the age of 15, and his most famous work was Boris Godunov. He still remains a very important Russian literary hero today, and also a hero in the military. Nikolai Gogol was an important Russian playwright who captured the beauty, but also really the grotesque nature of life in Russia. He's really a mix between early 19th century Romanticism and late 19th century realism. Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright and a short story writer. He's often considered to be one of the greatest writers of short fiction in history. His career as a playwright produced 4 classics, and his best short stories are held in high esteem by writers and critics everywhere. Ivan Turgenev was also a Russian novelist. He was a short story writer, poet, playwright, and also translated and popularized a lot of valuable Russian literature for the West. His famous novel Fathers and Sons, published in 1862, is regarded as one of the most famous works of 19th century fiction. Also very consequential and well-known was Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was a Russian novelist, short story writer, essayist, and journalist. His literary works really experienced human psychology on a level that had never been seen before. Particularly, his examination of human psychology takes place in the troubled political, social, and spiritual atmosphere of 19th century Russia, and he engages with a lot of important philosophical and religious themes. His most acclaimed works include Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and The Brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky's body of works consists of 11 novels, 3 novellas, 17 short stories, and numerous other works. Many literary critics rate him as one of the greatest psychological novelists in world literature. Dostoevsky is very famous for his quotes about man and about the fall of man and sin and society and governments and the desire for redemption. Dostoevsky had been arrested in 1849 for belonging to a literary group that discussed banned books critical of Tsarist Russia. Therefore, Dostoevsky was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted at the last moment. He did, however, spend 4 arduous years in a Siberian prison camp, and then another 6 years of compulsory military service. Those experiences informed his literature and his great insights into man's psychological and religious worldview. Some of his more famous quotes are, "If there is no God, everything is permitted. To live without hope is to cease to live. The soul is healed by being with children. The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons. What is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love. Beauty is mysterious as well as terrible. God and devil are fighting there, and the battlefield is the heart of man. Men do not accept their prophets and slay them, but they love their martyrs and worship those whom they have tortured to death. Much unhappiness has come into the world because of bewilderment and things left unsaid." The other more famous writer of the late 19th century was Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy actually served as a war correspondent during the Crimean War, also a soldier, and he earned a literary reputation for himself during that conflict. He publishes probably the most famous novel of Russian literature in the 19th century. That's War and Peace of 1869, which commemorated a lot of the events of the Napoleonic Wars. His other famous work, published in 1877, was Anna Karenina. The most famous composer of 19th century Russia was Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky was an enormously productive composer who composed some of the more famous works that we still enjoy today, including the music to the Nutcracker Suite, also Swan Lake, Romeo and Juliet, and probably most famously, the 1812 overture with its famous cannons and celebrations that Americans play on their 4th of July celebrations. I conclude my discussion of 19th century Russia with contemplating the famous play Fiddler on the Roof. It opened on Broadway in 1964. Fiddler on the Roof is really the story of 19th century Russia, even though it takes place somewhere right at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a story of a father greatly concerned about his daughters marrying off to more modern figures and losing their traditional Jewish heritage and particularly peasant culture. That's a great symbol of 19th century Russia, a conflict between modernization and also tradition. And it is with great difficulty that Russia really stumbles into the 20th century. And its inability to resolve those questions is going to lead to its great revolution early in the 20th century, 1917, enormous suffering throughout the first half of the 20th century.